everything you learned on Sesame Street apply to your time on a panel. Be friendly, share your microphone, share your time, don't say anything crazy. It's very, very basic. I've sat on dozens of panels and most of them have been great, but I still am sometimes surprised at how sometimes people don't understand the basics.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author Podcast, I talk with Michael La Ronn about moving from page to platform, how to succeed as an author speaker. This is a two-part series, and in this first part, we discuss types of talks, not just the usual suspects. Even if you don't have a goal of making paid speaking engagements part of your repertoire, you are an author speaker if you participate in interviews, including podcasts, or panels or author readings, and we share best practices for those types of events. We discuss the pros and cons of in-person and virtual events, and we discussed finding your goals as a speaker and establishing yourself as a true professional. And now let's hear from Michael La Ronn and me about moving from page to platform, how to succeed as an author speaker. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Michael La Ronn. Hey, Michael, how are you doing?
Great, Matty. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And Michael has been on the podcast so many times that I can't imagine anyone needs an introduction anymore. But if you would like to check out what Michael has to offer to his fellow indie authors, just go to authorlevelup.com or check out Michael's YouTube channel at Author Level Up, both of which are fantastic resources. And so today we are going to be talking about from page to platform, how to succeed as an author speaker. And listeners will also know that Michael and I just had a book come out on this very topic. Yay! So in addition to the long, long list of nonfiction books that Michael has written for his fellow indie authors, both of us have added one to our portfolio. So, Michael, I thought it would be fun to let the listeners know how this book came about, and you graciously volunteered to share that story with them.
Sure. So it's been a couple of years, so fill in the blanks if I happen to miss anything. But we were at Writer's Digest in New York City, annual conference. They have it every year. It's a really big conference, and we happened to be speaking together separately. We had two different things we were talking about, but I had been on the podcast before, and I think we had met and had some virtual chats before, but this was the first time we had a chance to meet in person. And so we hit it off really well. And it was one night over drinks, I think we were talking, and we were talking about speaking, and we were sharing our different speaking experiences and telling war stories, so to speak. And I just mentioned that, this would be really cool to collect into a book one day. And then Matty was like, we should write a book. And I was like, we probably should write a book. That'd be fun. And then the rest was kind of history. We started planning, and now here we are with a published book.
Yeah.
So hopefully I didn't miss any details.
No, I think you hit all the important details. And I think that people can stay tuned for a book on co-authoring in the future, because we've learned a lot working on From Page to Platform that we would like to share with people. So as Michael told the story, the way we met was we were doing what I think a lot of people think of as the author speakers thing when we were at Writer's Digest, i.e. we get up on stage, we had a slide deck, we were talking to an audience, and we are going to be getting to that. I anticipate this is going to be a two-part episode because we have a lot to talk about. But I wanted to start out at a little different place, which is the types of talks that are not the usual suspects, and that I think are the more common, certainly for me was the more common way of getting into that kind of speaking engagement where you're standing on the stage and you're talking to people with a slide deck. And so we're going to be talking first about interviews and podcasts, panels, and author readings, which I think is an oft overlooked aspect of this. And I've spoken in the past because I'm a big proponent of using podcasts as a way of spreading the word about one's work, about interviews on podcasts. And I think it's a great example because it exemplifies a lot of the things that are important for any successful speaking engagement. Making a connection with the audience, understanding the goals of the organizer. Michael, as a frequent guest on podcasts, what are some of the top tips that you would offer listeners if they want to start out their speaking career with interviews on podcasts or other formats?
Yeah, interviews and podcasts are, as you pointed out, a great way to start to build your speaking acumen. I like to think about giving advice in this area is telling people just to start small. So you don't have to have super fancy podcast with fancy microphone and fancy video graphics if you happen to do it video version. Just start with what you have. And for a lot of people, that could be starting with just the built-in microphone on your computer. Not great, but that's it. You can at least start there. If you're willing to spend some money, then invest in a low-level professional microphone if you get nothing else. A microphone is going to make you sound a little bit better. The built-in microphones and webcams on your computer, not the greatest, but start with what you have by all means. And make sure that your audio is okay. It's decent sounding. Hop on a quick call with a friend and have them check how you sound, have them check how you look, make sure your background looks great. And then we can start to talk about, what do you say and how do you craft your message? But just remember that when you speak for the first time, you're making a first impression. When people see you on a podcast, like as people might be watching us on YouTube right now, they're going to get a first impression. They've never met me before. They've never met you before, Matty. And so investing your time and energy into that first impression is absolutely critical. And think about it like this. If you make a good first impression, you will get audiences more receptive to what you have to say, right? And if you can get them receptive to what you have to say, then you could potentially sell a book or bring people into your platform. So that's why that first impression is everything.
Yep. And I think that really hits on something that we emphasize throughout from page to platform, which is the importance of professionalism. And so professionalism isn't a function of tenure. It's a result of intent, like making the best first impression with your presence and your equipment and your portrayal of yourself and your portrayal of your books and so on. So I think that's just a topic we're going to come back to a lot throughout our conversation. And I also think that surprisingly enough, the idea of doing interviews is generalizable in the sense that a common piece of advice that I offer to people is make it conversational. So there's I think the dreaded podcast guest or interviewee of any kind is the one who comes with a very inflexible idea of what they want to say. And so regardless of the question the interviewer asks, they're going to go through their stump speech or list of topics. And it's a tricky balance because you want to go in prepared, but you don't want to go in robotic and you don't want to go in salesy. And that would seem, I think, on the surface to be something that would be specific to interviews. But I think it really is generalizable even to that idea of standing in front of an audience on a stage with a slide deck. You do kind of want it to be a conversation between you and your audience. And you want to be able to adjust even the slides you're showing based on the response you're getting from the audience. Very different if you're trying to make that adjustment on the fly virtually or in person. We're going to be talking about that a little more shortly, but I think as you're saying, for a lot of reasons, starting out with interviews on podcasts or maybe, your local news channel or whatever those interviews might look like is a great starting point for a speaking career. And just feeling comfortable talking. I mean, that's a huge hurdle to get over to begin with. Yeah,
you will never be worse than your first interview. So you can look up my first. Actually, I don't know if I have it on YouTube anymore, but I had my very first podcast interview. I would not recommend anybody watch it other than to simply see how not to do it. Right?
Yeah.
And it's just everybody, it's a rite of passage. Everybody is going to make that faux pas with your microphone or with your camera angle, or you're going to say something maybe you shouldn't have said. It just make those first interviews, get them out of the way. And you also start to learn what people like to ask you. And you need to learn your elevator pitch. So at the end of every interview, someone's going to ask you, hey, tell us more about where we can find you and all the things you're doing. Like, I've not done a single podcast interview where somebody does not ask that.
Yep.
You start to learn how to pitch yourself, right? And so you slowly start to learn how to speak in front of a crowd, even if you're speaking on a microphone to a wall. It's a similar concept, and you slowly get better at it the more you do it. But you've got to do it the first few times and make those mistakes and be willing to be bad in order to improve your craft.
Yeah, and be willing to watch those interviews, as painful as that might seem. Interviews are almost obviously recorded, but probably most of the speaking engagements you have, you'll have an opportunity to watch yourself do it. And you might not want to. Nobody ever likes to watch themselves on video or listen to themselves on audio, but it really enables you to pick those things out that you don't want to do anymore and to keep doing those things that you do want to do. I mean, I think people are just as likely to have a happy surprise as an alarming surprise if they listen to themselves, because you can, for example, watch the interviewer's face or the audience's face, and you can see, oh, I see that they were really engaged when I was telling that story I didn't know. So committing to watch and listen to yourself is an important part of becoming a professional author speaker.
Right. And you also start to get an intrinsic feel for what works and what doesn't in real time. So when I'm on a podcast, I usually know when I'm hitting the bullseye. Like I know when I'm landing. Mm-hmm. I also know when I'm not landing. Mm-hmm. And then you can slowly start to adjust your message accordingly. And the only way you learn that is if you rewatch yourself and swallow your pride and re-listen to your voice for a little bit.
Yeah. And that idea of starting small is great. You know, you don't want to pitch yourself to the biggest podcast or the biggest speaking engagement, the biggest conference, whatever it may be, right off the bat, because first of all, you're probably unlikely to get it unless you have a track record. You know, the bigger the event, the more of a resume they're looking for from their speakers. And also, you don't want an enormous audience for those early efforts. Yeah, I had somebody at a conference recently. They found out I had a podcast and they said, oh, I'm going to start at 1 and I'm going to, episode 1, I'm going to listen right through. And I was like, oh, no, don't do that.
Yeah, work your way back. Maybe don't work your way
back. Exactly. So that's just some very, very high level tips about interviews, including podcast interviews. Another thing that we talk about in the book that I think is oft overlooked is panels. And I don't think that authors think about panels as being a speaking engagement, but it requires a lot of the same preparation and the same ability to operate on the fly as, for example, an interview. So maybe even to a greater extent, because with a panel, you're very often going to be in person or in some way going to be able to see the response of an entire audience and possibly a moderator. And so, that's another great stepping stone into a broader author career. I think that the thing that's unique about panels is because it's a panel, you're not the only one on stage. You're working with a group of people, working cooperatively, hopefully, with a group of people. And so that is a little bit of a different dynamic. Michael, any tips you want to share about panel operations?
Yeah, everything you learned on Sesame Street apply to your time on a panel. Be friendly, share your microphone, share your time, don't say anything crazy. It's very, very basic. I've sat on dozens of panels and most of them have been great, but I still am sometimes surprised at how sometimes people don't understand the basics. Like if you are sharing a stage with 4 other people, don't take 5 minutes to answer a question, right? Like you have to be clear and you have to be concise. If you're sharing a stage with 4 other people, let them talk and be willing to disagree and have, congenial conversation. And it's just amazing sometimes how people don't understand that. So I think at the end of the day, your job as a panelist is to answer the questions that are asked, provide value to the audience, also build some camaraderie with your panelists to the extent that you can, because that is a networking opportunity as well. Can't tell you how many times I've said something on a panel and a panelist walked up to me afterwards and said, hey, I really like what you said about that. Let's get some coffee, So you're kind of working it from 2 angles. You're working the crowd, but you're also working the panel. And if you think about that, you'll start to think about it correctly.
Yeah, one of the things we're going to talk about probably a little later once we have some context to talk about it in is the goals of the speaker, and certainly networking and community building is one of them, and panels can be a fantastic opportunity for that. And I think that the Sesame Street analogy is great. And, if you have 4 people on the panel, then each panel should be taking about a fourth of the time of the overall panel when you go back and total it all up. And I think that the obvious lesson there is don't take more than your quarter, more or less. But I think another lesson is you owe the audience, your moderator, and your fellow panelists your quarter. You owe them your bit. And so you don't want to be a Mike Hogg. But similarly, you've been invited to the panel because there's a message that the organizer, the moderator, and the audience hopes you'll share with them, and you have a responsibility to do that. And so don't go in, figure, oh, I'm just going to be shy and retiring. You need to be willing to engage productively in that conversation that the panel is going to have.
Yeah. Sometimes there can be a groupthink that happens with panels where the panelists all kind of maybe share the same opinion, and so they all kind of go in the same direction on the question. So somebody will start it, and then the other person will say, oh yeah, going back off of what he said, blah, 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 blah. And then the next person will say, yeah, I echo everything that everybody else said. Don't be that panelist. Just offer your feedback and try to give something different than what the other panelists are giving. Yep. Because that makes you stand out. And that also, the audience likes that too. Because as an audience member, it's not really an enjoyable experience to constantly hear people say, oh, I agree with everything everybody else said.
Right.
I mean, It might be true, but it kind of takes away from your authority as a speaker. So try to avoid saying that as much as you can. Try to listen to what the panelists are saying before you and add your unique twist on the question, because that's why you're up there. As you said, Matty, I think you nailed it, that the organizer picked you for a reason. They didn't pick you to sit up on a stage and agree with everybody else.
Yep, exactly. Another of these sort of overlooked opportunities for speaking engagements is author readings. I could spend an entire episode, and someday I will spend an entire episode talking about author readings, because this is something that I have some pet peeves about. And I also think it's an opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity that is sometimes underutilized. And so, again, we're kind of building on some of the previous conversations. The responsibility with author readings is the same as with panels, except even more so. And so I think this is where the idea of serving the audience and serving the organizer, it's really easy to highlight it here, because the stakeholders in any author speaking engagement that you need to accommodate are yourself, your own business goals. I mean, that's a legitimate thing. The audience, and then the organizers, or in the case of a panel, the moderators and so on. And all of them have goals for the event. And for author readings, an organizer's goal is often to build their community or find ways of reaching readers themselves, in addition to the other authors that they're going to be inviting to that reading. And my advice there is always, my first advice is just follow the guidelines that the organizer or moderator provides, because there's a reason behind all of it. My pet peeve for readings is if the organizer says that you have 5 minutes and 7 minutes into it, they have to give you the hook. No, there's a reason they've given you 5 minutes, for example, because there are a whole bunch of other authors reading after you. And, now they're late, and now the audience is maybe getting restless because the organizer knows that their tolerance level is a 5-minute reading, whatever that might be. But you're there to serve your own needs. You're there to serve the organizer's needs. And then, of course, you're there to serve the audience, just as we were talking about with the panels, to read the audience and to give them the best performance that you can. And I think that the reason that authors sometimes overshoot their mark for timing is that, they have 8 minutes worth of information and they're going to try to cram it into 5 minutes. And nobody wants to hear 8 minutes worth of information crammed into 5 minutes. You want to give the audience time to actually hear the words you're saying and appreciate them. And you can't do that if you're rushing through it. And the only way to do that is to time it. The only way to do that is to get out a stopwatch, start talking, and hit stop when you're done and see if you've hit the mark or not. So I'm going to incorporate all my pet peeves about author readings in that little rant.
No, it's good, because this is one of the areas where we had completely different viewpoints when we were writing the book. Because I just don't do author readings. Mm-hmm. I don't find them that interesting, just me personally. And so I just don't do them because I think I would bore people. But, your tips in the book were really good and got me thinking like, maybe I should reconsider doing author readings, because I think the way you present it in the book, or the way we present it, I guess, because it's both of us in the book.
Yep.
I think it's really actionable and really helpful. And I think it would help you stand out, particularly in how you facilitate like your note cards. in your readings, I think would be really practical for a lot of people.
Yeah, the tip I offered was one that was offered to me by the late Tony Conaway, a member of the Brandywine Valley Writers Group, which is to have your notes on cardstock. Because reading from a book looks cool, but it's just way too many ways that can go wrong, and all sorts of other reasons the cardstock is the way to go. And I think that your comment about you haven't done author readings because it's not something you like participating in is another great generalizable point, which is you're going to be most successful at doing the things that you enjoy as a consumer. And so if you hate listening to podcast interviews, probably don't go for podcast interviews to begin with. At some point in your author career, you might have to start just accommodating the things that you don't really enjoy as a consumer because it's a good business decision, but don't start there. If you hate attending panels, probably don't pitch yourself as a panelist, because if you enjoy the format as someone who is in the audience, then you're more likely to be successful at it when you're the person on the stage. We have talked a couple of times so far about another huge consideration when it comes to author events, and that is the format. And by that, I mean whether they're in-person events or virtual events. And we talked a little bit about the pros and cons of each and how they can better or less well serve your goals of your author career. So, Michael, what are your thoughts about if people are considering starting out with either an in-person or virtual event, what are some considerations they should factor in?
Yeah, first, we should talk about background, because the proliferation of virtual events is a relatively recent thing. Before COVID, there was such a thing as virtual events, but they were very few and far between. And it wasn't exactly easy to get like these virtual speaking event gigs. And they certainly didn't pay. Very few of them paid. COVID kind of changed all of that, because a lot of conferences that met in person now had to go online because of the pandemic. And they found that they were able to get and attract more people from all over the world who were willing to come to these conferences. And so a lot of conferences now have a virtual component to them. Some conferences have a virtual conference and then an in-person conference. So COVID has kind of changed things, and I think that has been good. The good news is that it has never been easier to start a speaking career than it is today, because starting off with a virtual speaking event is a great way to get your feet wet. And that can open the doors to getting invited to in-person events. So what I encourage people to think about is, how are you most comfortable? There are going to be a lot of people who are listening to this podcast episode and are going to say, I don't like the idea of being on a stage in front of people talking about my book or talking about, something I'm an expert in. That's just not for me. But I could totally do it on a Zoom call, right? Because you're talking to a crowd of people, but they're in front of their computers. And sometimes these Zoom calls are pre-recorded. So it could be a very good way to get comfortable with all of the aspects that come along with speaking, of which there are many, but you can become a way to help you get comfortable with it. Now, there are going to be some people also who are listening to this podcast episode, and they're going to say, Zoom is not for me. I'd rather be shaking hands and meeting people and talking to people face to face. And if you're listening to this, you know which one of those people you are. You might be a mixture of both. And I would suspect that if I gave you the choice of in-person or virtual, there's probably one that you gravitate more toward than the other. And I would just encourage you to follow your instinct on that.
Yeah, I think that the personal side of that is totally legit. And then, of course, there's a practical logistical side as well. Like if you have a day job, can you take the time off to get to an in-person event? Virtual events have the obvious benefit that all it takes is walking from your kitchen to whatever area you've set up as your professional setting for the virtual events, whereas you have to factor in all that extra time for in-person events. But in-person events, of course, not only have that sort of emotional excitement that you can sometimes miss in virtual events, but I think they're also much better for networking. So we kind of are getting back to that concept that we talked about earlier, where you have to think about what your goals are. So if your goal is community building, then you're going to have more luck with that at in-person events. Not that it's impossible with virtual events, it's just more difficult if you're not looking the person in the eye and getting to shake their hand and so on. For a lot of people, travel is an important part of what they want to get out of an author speaker career. And in that case, then in-person events are what you're going to be wanting to go for. I think that one caution there, I would say, is never treat your virtual events with less seriousness than in-person events. I mean, I think that it's sometimes easy to fall into the trap of, if you're not standing in front of an audience of actual people looking at you, even if they're looking at you through the screen in a virtual event, there's an automatic seriousness that comes with standing on a stage in front of people that encourages a person to take care. But you don't want to say, oh, it's just a virtual event, so I'm not going to worry about prepping as much, or I'm not going to really worry as much about whether I'm dressed decently from mid-torso up or whatever that might be. Just don't allow yourself to fall into that trap of taking them less seriously than you would an in-person event.
I love that you said that, because one of the things that I've always taken to heart is I treat my in-person events and my virtual events the same. So the level of prep that goes into a virtual event is the same as an in-person event. And, you don't want to be that speaker that shows up and can't operate a Zoom call, right? Like you don't want to be that person. I would actually argue that it's worse to sit through a virtual speaker who doesn't have their act together than it is to sit through an in-person speaker that doesn't have their act together. And it just, everybody has sat through the Zoom call where the person doesn't know how PowerPoint works, or, can't figure out how to mute their mic or whatever, right? Treat them with the same level of respect and you'll get more out of it. And it'll make you also look more professional, going back to our theme of professionalism throughout the book.
Yep. One of the things we talk about a little bit with regard to virtual events is that the platforms can be somewhat different, and the ways that organizers approach the dissemination of a virtual event can be different enough that you do need to know. I mean, you need to know the basics, like sharing your screen and muting your mic and muting your camera and so on. But in some cases, the organizers are also going to ask you to moderate your own event. So that means not only giving your presentation or giving your talk, but monitoring the chat for questions and things like that. And one of the suggestions that you had made, which I thought was really interesting, the one I hadn't thought about before, is that if you start feeling overwhelmed, you have one of these opportunities and you start feeling overwhelmed at the idea of doing all these things, consider hiring an assistant to help you with that. Someone whose job it will be to monitor the Q&A for questions, or to maybe chat with a person who's having trouble figuring out how to sign on to the video or whatever it might be.
Right.
And so part of being a professional in some cases is engaging other professionals to help you portray yourself as the professional you are.
Yeah. And I'll caveat that with, I recommend that for paid speaking engagements, right? So if you've landed a paid speaking engagement, then, and they're asking you to do all of this stuff on the Zoom call, right, that you just mentioned, Matty, then I think hiring somebody makes sense, and you can do it for less than you think, right? So people think of the term hired and says, oh my gosh, you see dollar signs. It's actually, it can be quite reasonable. So that to me, I've always thought is worth the cost of paying some of the money I'm getting for the speaking event, investing in that to invest in a better experience for the audience and the organizer. And that also increases the chances of you getting invited back, which is another thing that you want to be thinking about, because that's how you land future speaking engagements as well. So you want to keep your organizer happy, keep the audience happy, but you definitely want to keep the organizer happy, and you want to bend over backwards to do that.
Yeah, I think that another thing that someday I'm going to write a book about, or at least do a podcast episode on, is this idea that people work so hard to get a first opportunity, and then they really underutilize the chances of capitalizing on that, both for themselves and the people they're working with. So, Michael, you're the perfect example of the advantage of professionalism and a wonderful performance in terms of interviews and podcasts, because how many times have you been on a podcast? I don't know, 6, 7, 8, something like that.
Yeah.
Because I know I can count on you to bring a great experience for me and the listeners. And So don't go to all the trouble. This will involve pitching. It will involve pulling together a speaker toolkit. It will involve doing the research to find who you want to pitch. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit in part 2. But then so often I see people get these opportunities, but then they don't behave in a way that encourages that opportunity to come up again with the same organizer or the same interviewer. Not necessarily that they're misbehaving, but if there's just not the follow-up, if there's not the relationship building, then you lose that. And the things that we've talked about so far, author readings, certainly. I've gotten invited back by the same organizer to author readings because he knows that I show up prepared and I'm on time to the event, and that I show up for the first reader and I stay till last, all those kind of best practices that we talk in the book about with author readings. Panels, I don't know if it's so much of a return engagement kind of thing, but definitely any kind of interview. If you ace an interview with someone about your first book, then you're more likely to be able to get in touch with them when your second book is out there and say, hey, I have another book and I'd love to come back and talk with you about it. So we have lots and lots of tips in the book for ways that people can pave the way to that kind of ongoing relationship that really helps both you and the person you're working with. Any other ideas on that front, like steps people should take in general to make those opportunities available?
Yeah. To make opportunities available, I think the best thing you can do is put 100% into every engagement that you do. So show up early, be prepared, handle yourself with professionalism and grace, even if the organizer does not, because sometimes the organizers might, they might be a little disorganized, right? But that doesn't mean that, you shouldn't be professional and shouldn't be, pleasant to work with. And also make sure that you work the audience. So answer their questions, stay on until the last question is answered, if you can do that. Sometimes you can't do that, but answer questions, be as thorough as you can, give the audience a lot of value in your presentation. So with a lot of times I speak, I like to come to the audience with gifts. Okay. I don't always do it, but I like to try, especially with in-person events. People are paying their hard-earned money and they're taking time off of work and away from their families to try to support their careers, to further their careers by being here. So I like to try to give them a free book, or I try to give them, something that they can use that's practical. So come with that free gift or that great call to action, or that I like to call them golden nuggets or nuggets of wisdom, right? That they can actually take and use. And people remember that, and organizers can see that too. So really, it's not about being the most clever person in the room. It's about mastering the fundamentals of being a speaker. If you get the fundamentals right, then it's a lot easier to get invited back, because a lot of people don't get the fundamentals right.
Yeah. I like that idea that you mentioned in the book about the fact that you make these gifts available without any strings attached. And so you're not requiring people necessarily to sign up for an email list or something like that. And you build that trust and more of a friendly relationship rather than a provider-customer relationship when you do that.
Right. Well, people are grown. People are adults, right? If they got value out of your talk, then they're going to check out your work. And if they like your work, then many of them will join your community. I could be a little bit more, I guess you could call it mercenary about getting email addresses and things like that. But people have already paid their money and given you their time. You don't need to ask them for emails again. Some people will disagree with me on that, and that's fine. And there is a time and a place for it. There are times when I do ask for email, but generally speaking, if I'm going to an in-person event, I'm going to give them a gift, and I hope that they enjoy it and they can use it. And those who want to engage with me further will do that.
Yeah, I think that the message there is not that gathering email addresses is bad, as you're pointing out, but that you don't have to do something just because it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. I think that we've been trained to just assume that if you give someone something, then what you expect in return is at least their email, and rethink those things, because in some cases that's the right thing to do, but not in all cases, and be intentional about it. And the other thing I think is really important, and this goes for virtual and in-person events, is be as professional, whether you're speaking to an audience of one as 1,000. And so probably anyone who's ventured out into any kind of public author events has had that experience of showing up at the author event and like this, the author speakers outnumber the audience, or it's a solo event and, your parents, your neighbor, and no one else shows up. But you can't use that as an excuse to now dial it down and say, oh, well, I don't have to deliver this with any professionalism. No, you owe it to your audience, regardless of the size, to deliver the same quality of presentation. And that's especially true with virtual events, because I've had experiences where I've been a guest on virtual like interview shows that are live, and I can see in the live event that there are not very many people in the audience. But then over time, you see people coming back for the replay, the audience building. And so just assume when you're doing a live virtual event that you're already speaking to thousands of people, because eventually you will. Eventually you will speak to many more people than you may see the little number at the bottom of the screen may be indicating. So I think that's probably a good point to wrap up the first part of our conversation. We're going to be talking a little bit more in the second part of our conversation about those. We've been talking about not the usual suspects. In the second part, we're going to be talking about the usual suspect, which is that scenario where you're standing on a stage virtually or in person speaking to an audience. And we'll cut this conversation short here, but Michael, let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Yes, if you'd like to learn more about me and all the things I'm doing, you can find me at authorlevelup.com. That's my website, and it's got links to all my books for writers and my YouTube channel and all the other resources I've got out there on the interwebs. And for those who are bold enough to check out my fiction, you can check that out at michaellaronn.com.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Michael. If you're looking for more information on how to optimize your speaker presence, you can check out episode 148, Making the Most of In-Person Events, also with Michael, and episode 153, The Importance of a Professional Photo and Video Presence with Wade Walton. If you're already doing speaking engagements, did my conversation with Michael give you any ideas for new best practices you might incorporate? If you're not already doing speaking engagements, did it encourage you to give it a try? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.